Hello and good evening to everybody present here. Today we are here to launch the book Smile Driving on a Wild Whale by P. Ahilyan, and it is being translated by Getha Sukumaran. To just briefly give you an introduction, P. Ahilyan, born in Jaffna, Sri Lanka, is a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Jaffna. He received a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and has also studied theatre. Ahilyan writes critical essays on poetry, heritage theatre, and visual arts. Ahilyan writes poetry in Tamil and has to his credit several poetry collections. His poetry has been translated into many languages. And Getha Sukumaran, our translator, and who is here with us today, is a poet, writer, and a translator. She has published Tamil translations of Sylvia Plath's poems and in English translations of Ahilyan's selected poems. She has published one poetry collection and another bilingual collaborative poetry and an art book with P. Ahilyan. Getha is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And to officially launch our book and to give the first copy, we would like to invite our very personal favorite, Kuti Revati, onto the Thanks. So before we actually move into our panel discussion, there is this very lovely note that Ms. Gopika Jadeja has forwarded to us, and I would like to read it. Yes, here it is. My greetings to Ahilyan, Getha, and to all of you present here today at the launch of A Smile Drawing on Me, a book that has been a decade in making. I'm sure that other speakers today will speak about the poetics and politics of this book, of Ahilyan's poetry and of Getha's translations. I'll keep that aside and speak about the making of this book and why the journey of this book is important. There are two impulses that have led to the making of this book: the lack of engagement and the exchange between writers in South Asia and the difficulty of publishing in marginalized and minoritized languages in our region. This is why we started 5 issues. First, the journal, and then the imprint in collaboration with Red River Press. Over 4 issues of the journal, the 5th is still to come, and beginning the imprint with Ahilyan's book, we bring voices from South Asia in conversation with each other. I said this book was 10 years in making. I visited Jaffna in 2015 and met Ahilyan there. And later in Attikilwa, when he heard I was going to Sri Lanka, Pranav Mukherjee, who has been the force behind 5 issues, told me I must meet Ahilyan. And Ahilyan showed me Jaffna. I went to Jaffna Public Library, to Point Pedro, to the university. I went to Public Library. I realized it was destroyed in the year I was born. In Pettiklua, Ahilyan and I had a long conversation. I read more of Ahilyan's poetry and then Getha's translation. We knew immediately that we will begin publishing under the 5 issues imprint with Ahilyan's book. Ahilyan had connected Getha and me on phone when we met in Pettiklua, and then in 2017 we began our conversation. We worked in the translations, editing them, discussing them, and then the pattern struck. Independent publishing ventures in our region are difficult, and they may die even before they begin. I'm glad that we were all here today to celebrate this book by Ahilyan and Getha, as well as to celebrate a book published by an independent publishing unit. As we launch this book, we celebrate the Tamil poetry and Tamil voices in Sri Lanka. We celebrate unheard voices wherever they are. Ahilyan's poetry reminds us about the human in the midst of dehumanizing conflict. In the time of ongoing war and atrocities in Gaza, in Ukraine, in many other parts of the world, Ahilyan's poetry and Getha's translations reminds us of the human cost and of what remains, of what we must sustain and renew. Thank you again for being present with us today as we launch this book, and for being with us in this act of listening, witnessing, and finding ourselves. That was Gopika Jadeja for all of you. Now, before we move into our panel discussion with Nandini, who told me that please don't give me an introduction because people will get bored. But Nandini, who is also a personal favorite, is a Tamil Nadu-based author and translator. Some of her published works include Pitched, The Modern Woman and Arranged Marriage, and Invisible Line, Inside India's Transmasculine Network. Before I introduce all three of them to the stage, there's this one line from the book that when I first opened the book, there's this one line I saw and immediately I fell in love with, and it was the beginning of the book, which said, "To the lives lost and still being lost in conflict across the world." On that note, all of you, the stage is yours.
So thank you everyone for being here and Getha for braving time zones and jet lag and everything else. Not so much for flying and she flew in from Jaffna today. But then you said the last 3 days you've been up into odd hours of the night doing your own research work. So thank you for being here. And when I say Jaffna, it strikes me that the actual name of the city is Yarpanam, which literally means the sound of music, like the music of the yard. And Jaffna is, first of all, a nonsense word and with no meaning, and it doesn't have any similarity to the Tamil word itself, right? So that's the question I wanted to first pose to you. Because so P. Ahila is also a performance poet, also is someone who's involved in theatre. And that's why I've asked Kuti Revati, who's a brilliant reader in addition to everything else she is. So I've requested her to read the Tamil version so that all of us can hear how dramatic the words are and how visual the words are. So I wanted to talk to you after that about translating the meaning, the sound, and the visuality. So over to Kuti Revati, who will start us off with the Tamil version, and then Getha will read her translation of that word.
முடிந்து போன மாலை பொழுது பார்க்கிறோம் விழிகொள்ளாம் துயரம் உதடுகள் துடிக்கின்றன தடுமாறி உயிராகும் வார்த்தைகளும் காற்றல்ல போய் தொலைகிறது நேற்று சணற்காட்டில் மஞ்சள் மௌனம் இன்று கண்களில் நீர் போகிறாய் மேற்கில் விழுந்து அணைகிறது சூரியன்
An evening that ended, we see eyes welling with grief, lips quivering, words stumbling, staggering to life, lost in the wind. Yesterday, a silence yellowing in the June feet. Today, eyes tearing, you left. The sun sank, disappearing in the west.
So here, it's such a visual poem. And I think Tamil is among the languages where you can use sentimentality without being cloying, where you can use rhyme as a weapon. But in English, it sounds cloying because we immediately think of nursery rhyme. So I was just thinking, maybe when you say Udadavel Tudikindana, you couldn't write trembling because the next line has stumbling. So all these as a poet also, and language and the sound of words must be very important to you. So can you talk to me a little bit, especially with P. Ahila, who is also a very visual person. Can you talk to me a little bit about your process of translation for these poems?
Sure. To begin with, Ahila's poetry has this imagery working like overlapping imagery, like words one after the other. Sometimes they are like together, sometimes they are like separate. Even the poems, I have the same feeling. Sometimes they all read as like one long poem, and then they're also separate poems. To think about how his poetry works, I think I have to look at poetry from conflict zones. That kind of defines how he has transformed language, how he has approached language through his experience of visual studies and his own engagement with art and teaching and all of that. So all of that informs his poetry, and not to forget the long Tamil tradition that he comes from, the poetry tradition that he has learned and he grew up with. So all of that has evolved into the language that I said to translate. I it's very difficult to say I translated because every poem Lata was with me. Like we would discuss so much about it, so much about the words, so much about the imagery, and then how we arrive at this language, and then what English does with those images. Like then also because I say it's poetry from a conflict zone, then it also requires a very close attention to the lyrics that he is putting in with all these words. So stylistically, there are choices that we can make in a regular poetry. But I say regular poetry, like poetry that is not about conflict, not about war. But when it is war, there is so much that each word does there. So I was very sensitive about it. It could be a very close translation that the approach that I took, and I think that is how I started with this.
I'm going to go a little bit more into the background. So when we spoke earlier, Geeta said something which was really beautiful about how activism is not sort of just being out in the streets and holding up posters. It's also translation is also an act of activism. You know? And I love that. And so for you've spoken about how you've been sort of grown up in grown up with the conflict essentially, because Madras was kind of like the backyard of Sri Lanka in those days in the 80s and 90s. A lot of militants were here. There were lots of, of course, there's a poem about the IPKF, but like Tamil Nadu was very involved in the Lankan conflict, and that was the Tamil Nadu in which many of us grew up. So, can you talk to me a little bit about your introduction to the conflict and your opinions on the conflict as a teenager? And then, as you got more and more involved, like you have, I'm sure, close friends and associates who have lived through the conflict. So, you're a little bit about, if you could just speak about how all those things have informed your involvement in the conflict itself.
I wouldn't say I'm involved directly in that sense in the conflict itself, but what it did was like the 80s and the 90s were the time poetry books, especially poetry, like so much poetry that I was exposed to at that time, especially in NCC. There was this literary circle called Panan, where there were students reading poetry, and that kind of it was like 93, 94 around that time. They were like young poets reading poems there, and we would meet every Friday. And I wasn't doing anything there, I was just listening. It was just that awareness that there is something that is unfolding, and at that age, I didn't even grasp the entire thing, but it's just that I knew that there is so much of suffering. I think that was what that was stuck to me at that point. And then after I got married and I moved to Canada, then I realized that Canada is the largest Tamil population outside Sri Lanka, right? So like every store, every grocery you go, there will be like newspapers, and there will be like stories, and there will be like reports, and every occasions like temples, anywhere you go, there's like people always there's conversations, and then suddenly there's like they share their experiences, their survival experiences, how they break things, and how they long for to go back to food, right? So it's like always I'm surrounded with that. So I did not start reading uneven thinking that I'm going to translate his poetry. I was just drawn into it. Like I wrote about it in my first volume. That was my very opening paragraph. Like after like 14, 15 15 years, I started doing my master's, and it was around the same time that I got this book from Chair. He first introduced me to this thin volume, Sarava Kavita. So when I opened the book, like it was so hard to move from one poem to another. Like it was so arresting that I was trapped. So like the only way to process or the only way to like think about the poetry or like to even get over the poetry was to translate it, and that actually became my master's not dissertation, what we call it, thesis. Yeah, yeah. So that became my dissertation. I'm not still done with it because of the forms that he has used, right? Especially Sarava Kavita. That is going to be a separate long writing which I haven't yet started.
So before we move to the next book, you're mentioning Canada and Google, it just reminded me of like, I studied in the UK and that was my exposure to people who had to leave Sri Lanka, Tamils who had to leave Sri Lanka. And I remember once at a Pizza Hut or something, I was waiting, and one of them was giving instructions to someone who had joined in Tamil, and then he said sorry. And then I said Paravala because it was the first Tamil I had heard in a long time, and automatically, then his eyes lit up and he said, Jaffna? I said no. He said Colombo? I said no. He said India? I said Madras, and he looked so disappointed. And I was just thinking, for people, even strangers can become friends when your home has been taken away. And I think you spoke about conflict and Tamil poetry in the conflict, and it just struck me that a lot of Sri Lankan writing by Sinhalese people, whether it's Ramesh Gunasekara, Shihan Karunatilaka, Ashok Fere, it's not about the conflict. Even if the conflict is there, I mean, you can write a book about cricket or you can write a book about a photographer, whatever, But in Tamil writing by Tamils, I'm sure even if someone wrote an English novel who is a Sri Lankan Tamil, they cannot escape the conflict, even if they have been born outside of the conflict. So I think the next poem gives us some insight into this. So maybe we'll move on to that and then we can talk a little bit more about
Sure.
what people leave behind, basically.
Yes. I think the next one is thank you, sir.
உடல் உருக்கள் மூவரி பத்து ஒற்றை நெடுங்கால் தொடைப்பட கிழிந்த இல்லா மறுகாலுக்கு ஒரு இரத்த கொண்ட ஒற்றை நெடுங்கால் தொடைப்பட கிழிந்த இல்லா மறுகாலுக்கு ஒரு இரத்த கொண்ட
A single long leg. A single long leg. Bloody hair instead of the missing leg, ripped from the thigh. A single long leg. Bloody hair instead of the missing leg, ripped from the thigh.
ரோசா நிறத்தெழுந்து உப்பி பருத்து உதரம் திறந்து உதரம் மூடிய பெருவட குடல் சுருளே ரோசா நிறத்தெழுந்து உப்பி பருத்து உதரம் திறந்து உதரம் மூடிய பெருவட குடல் சுருளே
O large, bloated, looped intestine, sealing the gaping stomach, bulging, rosy. O large, bloated, looped intestine, sealing the gaping stomach, bulging, rosy.
மூடா வாய் நிறைத்து மார்பேறிய எறும்பு வரிசை உலகை காணும் முன் கல்லாய் சமைந்த வெண்ணிற பிஞ்சு கண்களே மூடா வாய் நிறைத்து மார்பேறிய எறும்பு வரிசை உலகை காணும் முன் கல்லாய் சமைந்த வெண்ணிற பிஞ்சு கண்களே
Ants fill the opened mouth, climb down the chest. Oh, tender white eyes turned to stone before they could see the world. Ants fill the open mouth, climb down the chest. Oh, tender white eyes turned to stone before they could see the world.
திறந்த பெருங்கால்கள் தொடைநீளம் கிழிந்த குறியிடம் பெருகு ரத்தம். திறந்த பெருங்கால்கள் தொடைநீளம் கிழிந்த குறியிடம் பெருகு ரத்தம். பெருகு ரத்தம்.
Long legs split open, turn along the length of the thigh, a stream of blood for genitals. Long legs split open, turn along the length of the thigh, a stream of blood for genitals. A stream of blood.
ஒரு மார்பு சரிந்து மறுமார்பு தடத்தில் அட்டைகள் சுருண்ட புதையா பிரேத பெண்ணே. ஒரு மார்பு சரிந்து மறுமார்பு தடத்தில் அட்டைகள் சுருண்ட புதையா பிரேத பெண்ணே.
One breast drooped, leeches curled up where once there was another breast. Oh, unburied woman, corpse. One breast drooped, leeches curled up where once there was another breast. Oh, unburied woman, corpse.
Yeah.
No, these are very hard. You spoke about there are 10, these words was half the poem basically. There are 5 out of the 10 that's you were speaking about how this was one of the hardest poems for you to translate. And I mean, first there's the imagery, but second there's also the alliteration, like, Pudayai Predai Penne, the alliteration of that. And I think you mentioned Cheran as having introduced you to Adilan's poetry, and everyone was heard Cheran read, I would say, because he's a performer also. I remember one poem which he read which sounded like gunfire, and he had structured it to sound like gunfire. And here again, the images are so vivid, and I think to move a little bit away from the graphic images themselves, I'd like to speak a bit about the structure of the language, because you had to bend the rules of English grammar in order to convey that. Because when you see the poems side by side, they look similar. You made sure that the lines were around the same length. I'm sure, you and Lata worked
Because we worked so much on this poem, like word by word, and then the title itself is like Movie Pathar. So like it has to be 3 lines, and it has to like connect not with just the images, the sounds, and obviously it cannot connect with Tamil sounds. It has to be the English sounds, and within that, the language. The language I wanted to, it might like the fragmented sense that comes out of this poetry, this translation. It was deliberate because Adilan writes in that language. So for me to smooth it out into a rosy translation means that I'm erasing his voice, his experience, the way he has used language. Obviously, I cannot do justice to the way he has used Tamil language because it's different languages. At the same time, smoothing it, I was thinking like this English would be a base for another translation. So then when that translator looks at the English poem, like what would the poem sound like? Like where is that fragmentation? There is no experience of that fragmentation. So that was the sense that guided me through this translation.
And I think I'd also like to talk a little bit about choosing words. Like I was saying earlier, like to take a very tame example, whether someone writes Kadidam or Madal, the sound is different in Tamil. And in English, you can't just say letter for both. As I would say, do I say letter, do I say epistle? What do I say? Do I say note? Do I say message? So, things like that. And there's another poem which is also a very hard read. So it's called Irupur. So I'm not going to read it or have them read it. But there's this one particular word where he says Yodivai Kiriya Punarnu. So Punarva is generally sex in Tamil. But you've used the word rape. He didn't write Karpadipu, he didn't write Paliyal Vanmurai. but you use the word rape instead of sex. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the choice of words. What dictated them for you? Because it's not all intellectual; it's also instinctive, right?
Yeah, I think there it was completely instinctive, and where it's possible, I try to like let the poet speak. But here, I think there's my instinct took over the original, and I was debating it for a very long time, and I think I could not move to sex. There was something that was stopping me. So I thought about it, and Gopika and I spoke about it, and then we decided I'm not able to give you that logical reasoning of how I made that choice. Sometimes it's very deliberate, sometimes it's very conscious, sometimes it is just there that it becomes so difficult to move away from that word. And this is one of those instances.
I think here is when, like I was speaking to you earlier about how I believe that, I don't, as a translator, I don't believe there's any language which cannot cover an emotion, in the sense that you might not have an exact word for some such thing. But then there is a way to bring it out with words. But when we look at conflict zones, like for instance, now the image of the baby is something which we have seen again and again in Palestine right now, the last couple of years. So, some places they automatically language becomes more easily violent in the sense that the violent words are more easily available in, let's say, Tamil or Arabic because of the conflicts that they are facing for the poets there. And even normal words like punarchi would become violent in context, whereas when you're translating it into a language which is not at the center of a conflict, of a war, I guess it's a little harder like you have to make the language violent in order to bring out the emotion, I would say. Is that something you found?
Yes, and I think there's a profound sense of empathy and solidarity that one should have when we think about poetry in or from conflict zones. Because I think without that, it is so hard to relate to the experiences that the poets speak. So it was, I think it is this sense of this empathy and solidarity that guides translations. And also like to think about words in that how you bring violence. If I don't know how if that emotional connect like to because I have never experienced war. I've never born and brought up in a situation like that. War was like entirely um, an experience that like completely transforms a person, right? A person, a society. So when I think of like when I say empathy or solidarity, it is not just the poet, it is also the people in the poems. It is the readers, it is the author, it is the translator, it is the landscape. There is like so much speaking there. It's all of these voices. Only when they speak to the translator, I think the translation comes out with that same emotion that the poet is setting up. Convey.
And when the conflict ended in 2009, which was, I think, that was when it kind of became like when the war essentially ended with the killing of Prabhakaran. That was when the conflict as such became known to people outside of Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, and maybe to some extent Canada, Australia, Europe, pockets of those. But then, to Sinhalese Sri Lankans, right? It was a triumph. It was like, okay, now it's a new country, there's so much excitement. Whereas it was kind of like, I don't know, a sense of defeat, not because of the end of the war, I think, but because what were they going to come back to, for the people who had been forced to leave? What would Tamil Sri Lankans who had left home come back to? Um, and I mean, like I met this lady who had left Sri Lanka in the 90s, and she said her parents and she had left. Her sister stayed behind to leave. There was a bombing in the village, and they don't know what happened to the sister. No one was able to contact her. They don't know now Like when I met her, it was about 2005. So they didn't know 12 years later whether she was alive or not and where she is. And that's what war does to families, right? So could you, I don't know where you were when the conflict ended, but could you speak a little bit about the prevailing emotion at the time among Sri Lankan Tamil writers?
I'm not sure if I can get deep into this because one thing is um, it's a situation that I will relate to, but not in the way that people, writers from that soil would relate to. So I'm very conscious of not stepping into that zone where I speak about the survivors, about the war, putting it in my own words and putting it in my. That is one thing that I've always been very, very conscious about. That I am an outsider. That I'm seeing this, but I cannot represent, I cannot speak of their emotions. I think
No. I mean by reading their work, did you find that there was a prevailing emotion at the time, or
oh yeah, big time, big time. I was surrounded by so much conversations and so much street protests. There was so much that was going on at that time. And there's so many things that's still alive in so many different ways, right? So, Mundivaita Kanji is one of those where that we have Kanji in all the Tamil stores. It's distributed. It's a commemoration thing that is being done. So there's so many different ways that people come together and talk about this.
Muliveka Kanji is actually something which because when I was looking up kind of your area of research and everything on the internet, I found you had written a little bit about this. Is that something you'd like to speak about now?
Yeah, like
Is it
my
food that, yeah.
yes, my PhD was on war and food memories and food waste like resilience, right? Food resistance, like how people survived during the war, like how did they grow food, how did they eat, what are the ways they sustain themselves, like where did they find the resources, the role of women, all of that. This is what I looked at in my dissertation. So after the translation, I took a different trajectory, which now has led me to like sustainable farming and all. Now my conversations are all with farmers and home gardeners and seed savers and how they are like protecting the environment. So I see this is also a conflict, but a different kind of conflict that we are surrounded now, right? And it also comes to that same resilience, like food practices and resilient food ways, how we mitigate climate adversities. So there's like different nodes that I'm working on now.
No, and it's very interesting. Like a lot of people don't think of the connection between food and war, but then there's one extreme where like right now we are watching starvation right in Palestine, but the other is like Tahrir Square also. There was this food called kosheri, which essentially has everything, and they called it the food of the revolution because it's a fast food, and all the sellers were distributing it for free to sustain the people who were protesting, who were standing there and protesting, and things like that. Kanji has that quality of sustenance, of giving you energy to stand there and protest, right? So I think that's such an important issue, and I can't wait to see what your research produces. But to go back to the book, let's move on to the next poem.
Sure. Yeah.
This actually, Uttara actually relates very much to what we spoke about, to what are you coming home to, right? Yeah. This is beautifully written.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite.
உத்தரை தோட்டத்தில் செந்தாழ் மலர்க்குடலை நிலா சொரிந்திருக்க கண்டார். தொலைவில் காவல் அரண்களில் தீ நாக்குகள் புள்ளிகளாய் தெரிந்தன. பேரமைதி அச்சமூட்டியது. சிதிலமடைந்த மாளிகையின் நெடுந்தோங்கிய நிழல்களை ஆழப் பார்த்தார். எப்போதும் பிடிவாதமாய் முன்செறியும் குழற்கற்றைகளை பின்தள்ளியபடி எப்போதும் போல அவன் தோன்றி நின்றானா என பெருமூச்சு விட்டாள். கூட்டம் கலைந்து விட்டது. கூடத்து நிலை கண்ணாடியில் அவளை பார்த்தாள். அவள் விராடனின் கனவை, அபிமன்யுவின் பேரழகிலே, நீ அல்ல இது, யாரோ, வேறு யாரோ. அஸ்தினாபுரத்து இளம் விதவைகள் கூட்டத்தில் ஒருத்தி அரற்றியபடியே வெளியே பார்த்தான். பெருச்சோடிய தெருக்களில் யாரும் இல்லை.
Uttara. She saw the moonlight pouring into the basket of screw pine flowers in the garden. At a distance, the fiery wings in the watchtowers appeared as dots. The grave silence was terrifying. As usual, she gazed intensely at the long, towering shadows of the ruined palace. Brushing aside her curly tresses that cascaded stubbornly forward, expecting his arrival. She breathed a deep sigh. The crowd had scattered. She looked at herself in the mirror. Oh, Virata's dream. Oh, Abhimanyu's beauty queen. This is not you, someone else. One among the crowd of young widows of Hastinapur. Lamenting, she looked outside. On the deserted streets, there was nobody. There was nobody on the deserted streets.
I think this is the point in you, the two different ways of ending it. On the deserted streets, there was nobody. There was nobody on the deserted streets where, it's, you've echoed it yourself because this was instinct, I guess, because the Tamil line, that one line is so heavy and it needs to be repeated in two different ways to bring home the emptiness, I think.
Yeah, I think there's some poems that we could use that liberty that I used it very less, very sparsely, where only that emotion could bring by this kind of thing that creatively that I could do. That's where I used it, and it was very limited.
And because Ahula is some, when you're working with somebody who's involved, you're translating the work of someone who you've been associated with for a while. And more importantly, someone who's around to maybe answer questions and discuss it with. Can you tell me a little bit about your interactions with him while working on the translation?
Definitely, because there's a lot of points that he's a very subtle poet, right? To make the meanings or to make the words speak to me. Sometimes I have to ask him literally what does this mean? What is the reference you're making? There could be one whole incident, there could be one whole murder, and he just says one word here and a line there. And in between these lines and words, there is so much. So it's a translator who fills those gaps, but not in the way that where you fill for a poet. It has to be done in a very respectful way. So, but at least to convey the what the poet conveys with the same gaps and with the same distance that he maintains, there was a constant conversation with the poet, with the landscape, the way he writes about the landscape. I would use satellite images. Because I hadn't gone to Japan at that point. So I could use all of these images, the landscape, YouTube videos, whatever I could get. I was watching one after the other to have that sense, so that I can bring that the truth that he's speaking about.
And the next one?
Yeah, one. This is the last one. That's it.
வீடு திரும்புதல் 3 தசாப்தங்களுக்கு பின்னால் இருக்கிறது வீடு. எண்ணங்கள் அதற்கு பின்னால் வளைந்து சிதறி மடங்கி உள்ளடர்ந்து ஒடிந்து நீள்கிறது மேலும் விரிந்து. இப்போது திரும்புகிறேன். இரத்த சிவப்பில் ஒரு குளம், மாலைக்கும் மாலைக்கும் நடுவில் ஒரு பொழுது, இருள் அல்ல பகலும் அல்ல, வெறுமையின் பேரிரைச்சலை காண்கிறேன். வீடு நினைவாகி கரைகிறது. நீ அழுத கண்ணீர் பெருநதியாய் பெருக்கெடுக்கிறது பல்லாண்டுகள் கழிந்தும். துப்பாக்கி சன்னங்கள் சீரும் பொழுதிலும் எப்போதும் என் பால் திரும்பும் வசீகர விழிகளை இதயத்தில் பொத்தியபடி நகர்ந்துள்ளேன். ஏதும் இல்லை, காலமெனும் கொடுமையை ஏற்று நடக்கிறேன். முறிந்த மொட்டை பனையிலிருந்து பெயரறியா பறவை பறக்கிறது. இப்போது எங்குள்ளாய்? எந்த நாட்டில்? இன்னும் அந்த அடங்கா நேசத்தை யாரும் அறியாரும் எனக்கு கட்டளையிடும் அந்த பெரிய விழிகளை புயல் சென்று முடிந்த காலமெல்லாம் காத்து வைத்திருந்தாயா? வருகிறேன், அதே நிலங்களை கடக்கிறேன். அவை அவை அல்ல, எல்லாமே புதிதாய் உள்ளன. விட்டு சென்றவற்றை தேடி தோற்கிறேன். ஒரு முறை, ஒரே ஒரு முறை உன்னை காணுதல் நிகழுமா? நீங்க மறுத்து நீங்கி செல்லும் உன் கண்களை, பட்டொளி வீசும் உன் குரலை. இப்போதும் அமைதி இல்லை. பாலை பொழிகிறது. எதை தேடி உயிர் காக்கிறேன் அன்பே?
Returning home 3. My home is 3 decades behind. Thoughts wander ahead, bent, scattered, covered with thorns. They break and creep further. I return now, a pool, blood red, a time between parley and twilight. It was not dark, it was not day. I see a clamoring void. Home is a memory that melts away. Your tears flow and swell as a river after many years. Even when shrapnel flew, I'm holding in my heart your enchanting eyes that always turn towards me. There is nothing left. I walk carrying this cruelty called time. A bird whose name I do not remember ascends from the broken volcano. Where are you now? In which country? After the storm has withered, do you still wait with your unbound love, with eyes that command me secretly? I return. I cross the same lands. They're not the same. I'm lost searching for those I left behind. Your eyes that leave, refuse to leave. Your voice that shines like silk. Once, just once, will I see you? Even now, there is no peace. The parley pours, my love. What am I looking for? What am I living for?
Beautiful poem. Even in the motherland, the love poems are not love.
Yeah, you say that into the mic so everyone hears.
Even in the royal lands, even love poems are not just love poems. They are more layered, more layered.
Yeah, and then I was just thinking, what does it take to have to literally run away from shrapnel, right? And that's how your relationship ends. Where you have no idea, even if the other person is alive, where they've gone to, like what it must take to get on a boat. Because even like this unknown sea is better than what you have to face in, you know, in the homeland.
Yeah, I think it's that upliftness that I think that is what is also dictating his poems, like the language, right? That there's nothing guaranteed. There's an evening and then tomorrow there is no morning, there is no evening. So it's that sudden stop, it's that sudden end where there are friends that you've been in conversation, you meet them, they are cycling together, they're in schools together, and then all of a sudden you have no idea what happens to that person. And even when they leave, you have no idea, like after so many years, whether you will be even be meeting them again. I think it is this sudden loss that is a constant in literature from Sri Lanka, Tamil literature.
And I mean, I was just thinking of that lady whom I mentioned, whose sister, they don't even know whether she's alive now. And I guess, there is social media and all of that, but sometimes I wonder, like when we think of our childhoods, when those of us, who have not lived in conflict zones, even with everything, all the security of a childhood and all that, you can remember faces from your early years, you can't remember names sometimes. You don't remember who that person sitting next to you in class was, like what they were called. So even with social media, how would you even search out that person? What is their surname now? What do they look like now, right? Because there's always that which people say, like, but nowadays there are lots of reunions. But then I guess that what is that person's name now? What did they migrate as? What passport did they get? Who fixed it up? So I guess there's so much. I don't know if that's something which you're familiar with, in the sense people who have tried to find those whom they knew.
Uh, no, I do know, but those are very difficult emotions that even just listening to them that I have felt. I think it's a very deep emotion to speak.
Right. So then we'll close the evening with one final poem,
Yeah.
which
These poems were really for us. So நம்ம எந்த கவிதை எழுதினாலும் இதுதான் பேராமீட்டர்ஸ் வேணும். ஸோ இதை தாண்டி இந்த டெப்த் இல்லை, இந்த லாங்குவேஜ் இல்லை, இந்த தேட்ரிக்ஸ் இல்லைன்னா இட்ஸ் நாட் a poem for us, right? Because this has been always there before us, like some of poetry. And the ஏழு பெண்கள் கவிதைகள் வந்து இன்னும் they were very dramatic and அவ்வளோ உண்மை தமிழ்ல எழுதப்படுற கவிதைகள்ல இவங்களுடைய கவிதைகள் தான் எல்லாம். நம்ம வந்து நம்ம வீடு பத்தி எழுதலாம், குழந்தைங்க பத்தி எழுதலாம், குடும்பம் பத்தி எழுதலாம், ஒரு மலரை பத்தி எழுதலாம். ஆனா அவங்க ஒரு மலரை பத்தி எழுதும்போது அதுல நேரம் இருக்கு. ஸோ அப்படியான போயம் உங்க முன்னாடி இருக்கும்போது how you write, ஒரு போயம், ஒரு கவிதையை நீங்க எப்படி பார்க்குறீங்கிறது இஸ் வெரி வெரி இம்பார்ட்டன்ட். கவிதை அல்லது சொற்களை அழித்தல். கவிதை என்றால் என்ன என்கிறார்? உயிர் வாழும் ஒரு முறை என்கிறார். கவிதை எதனால் ஆயுது என்கிறார்? சொற்களால் அல்ல என்கிறேன். எங்கிருந்து வருகிறது கவிதை என்கிறார்? மூல பெருங்காற்றின் வேர்கள் ஒழுங்கும் புகை உச்சிகளிலிருந்து என்கிறேன். ஏன் கவிதை என்கிறார்? யாத்திரை செய்ய என்கிறேன். கவிதைக்கு தர்க்கம் என்கிறார். அதர்க்கத்தின் தர்க்கம் என்கிறேன். கவிதை எழுதுகிறாயா என்கிறாய்? இல்லை, கண்டெடுக்க ஆசீர்வதிக்கப்பட்டேன் என்கிறேன். எதுவாய் உள்ளே என்கிறாய்? கவிதையா என்கிறேன். நீ கவிஞனா என்கிறாய்? இல்லை, பரதேசியாக ஆசை கொண்ட கயவன் என்கிறேன். கவிதை உண்மையா என்கிறாய்? உண்மையிலும் உண்மை, பொய்யிலும் பொய் என்கிறேன். கவிதையும் நீயும் யார் என்கிறாய்? ஒன்றுமின்மை என்றேன். ஒன்றுமின்மை என்கிறேன். இப்போது மறுபடி கேட்கிறேன், கவிதை என்றால் என்ன? சொல் என்கிறாய். வெளியை துப்பும் வெளி என்கிறேன். Poetry or erasure of words. You ask me, what is poetry? I say, a way of life. You ask me, what is poetry made of? I say, not words. Where does poetry come from? You ask. I say, from the heights of the caves where breath attains liberation. Why poetry? You ask. To travel, I say. You ask about logic in poetry. It is the illogic of logic, I say. Are you writing poetry? You ask. No, I say. I was blessed to find poetry. What is your form? You ask. Poetry, I say. Are you a poet? You ask. A thief wanting to be a wayfarer, I say. Is poetry truth? You ask. I say, it is the truth of truths, lie of lies. You ask, who are you and poetry? Nothingness, I say. Now you ask again, what is poetry? Tell me, you say. An expanse, spitting another expanse, I say.
Could I ask you both as poets in your own right to respond to this interpretation of poetry individually? Take it something of as a poet, what is your response?
She's been doing it.
I think it's the layers. It's poetry, like, is it defined by words? Is it defined by images? Is it defined by rhythm, music? I think it's a combination of all of this that opens these layers. You start reading something and then you arrive at something else, and still, like, your mind is like constantly thinking, oh, it is that that defines that poetry, because suddenly there's like so much in front of you with just few words. I think that is how I look at poetry.
ஒரு definition வேணா கொடுக்கலாம். They think words of justice. Poetry is, words of justice, because this voice is for everyone. எல்லாரோட வாய்ஸையும் அட்ரஸ் பண்ண வேண்டியது ஒரு poetோட டியூட்டி. பாலஸ்தீன்ல வந்து poetry தான் நமக்கு ஒரு பெரிய மீடியமா to spread across the globe. Poetry இல்லைன்னா we wouldn't have heard the voices of the, anyone. அவங்களால voiceless நம்ம கேட்டிருக்கவே மாட்டோம். So I think poet is not a single person. It's multitudes. There is no singular poet in the world. Poet has to represent the justice of every person, hopeless, aimless, voiceless. It's too much for a poet, but he's a poet, she's a poet.
This one man saying, "Uyirvaadum oru murai," and a way of life or a way to live. Makes you think about. I mean, even in, let's say, the conflict literature of Manto, sometimes you wonder, or even when you read about conflict, you wonder, like, when your entire family is being lined up to be shot, why are you hiding in the rice barrel, knowing that you're going to lose everything that you love? What is it about the human, I guess, what is it about human instinct that makes us want to live, even when everything is lined up against us? And when I hear these poems, that's the feeling I get, that there's something through all this gore and grief, there's something of hope, there's something in us which wants to live, because there's always the hope of a better tomorrow.
Yeah, the hope of better tomorrow, and then the hope of making it visible, make others witness this. When you are a witness, right? So you have that thing, like the responsibility, the urge to let others know what you're witnessing, to make others witness, to make others see what is happening, right? So that, I think, that comes with the idea of hope also. So the writing itself, the act of witnessing, the way how you open that witness the rest of the people. Like nobody else was there. It was just the person. It was just the survivor. So I think that is an important part of what we think as hope too.
That's beautiful actually, because I mean, if that person wasn't hiding in a rice barrel, there's no one to tell us what happened to the rest of his family, right? So that whole idea of if no one heard the tree fall, did it really fall? So much without witnesses. And I think even now in Gaza that's happening, like because of social media and all the journalists who are every day bringing that horror to us, we at least know what's happening. And for the first time in decades, there are nations recognizing another country, right, against the might of all the forces. So I guess that's what witness can do. So the poet as a witness is a very uh, interesting concept. And being in your own life also, you've spoken about like when you started writing, it was kind of like women had to be heard, women were not being heard. And suddenly from being witnesses, they silent witnesses, they became voices. So could you talk a bit about that and then we come back to
When we were saying on this, conversing on this, I think somewhere we are consumed by the routine, mundane, dailiness. But there is a voice inside that has been suppressed, oppressed, and it's coming, screaming out. It has been always there. It doesn't get erased at all. I think. Because I've been editing few area women poems, poetry collections these days. I cannot read two poems at a stretch. It's too heavy and it is screaming from the page and it doesn't even relate to their daily life at all. She's working in a corporate office somewhere, she's traveling, going in London and in Europe. But the Tamil words, they are bubbling up in the paper, in the pages, just too, hitting on things. So it is not, maybe after this 2009, it has been rising up every day because maybe we can talk about the silence, but it is not relevant these days. Our voices are always coming out screaming, and poetry is very, very damp, compelling and commanding to please hear it, listen to us. It's like it gathers everyone's attention, I believe, across the world. Poetry is a universal language now, you know. So, and after this conflict thing, Gaza, freedom ஆகட்டும், இப்பதான் நம்மளுக்கு அந்த poetry ஃபார்மோட ஒரு பீக் டைம், ஒரு கான்டெம்பரரினஸ், ஒரு ஹை modernity is operating, functioning at its peak right now.
No, because today when we were speaking, you were at the Geeta was at the airport actually. We were waiting to catch our flight here when we spoke, and she was saying, let's have a little bit of poetry about love because all of this is so heavy. So but like you said, conflict, even love is not love.
And for women, it is more than that. I think we have to go for reading more women poetry as well. It comes with a totally different vocabulary and language. Because when we talked about this Punarlu thing, it's more feministic area. That's why she can come out with violence operating in that.
Yeah.
It's
That's
very,
why I was pushing against the word sex, or because I found that so that there is this dimension of how violence is spoken about by men in the field.
we don't use the word culture at all.
Yeah.
We don't these days. And vulnerable also we don't use this. We want to the violence, the dimensions of violence to be encoded in the word is very important.
Yeah, I mean that is such an important point that you made about how when women write, it's a whole different because
Very different.
women's bodies have been weaponized for a very long time. As in, women's bodies have been used by enemies as a right from Draupadi. right? It all comes down when you want to start a war, you use a woman's body. So also the book, in addition to the poems, is a lot of sort of value adds. There are interviews with the author and the translator, as well as the covers of his books. And oh my, this is something we should talk about, the cover photograph. I mean, the history of it is in the book itself, but could you tell us a little bit like what you know about the photograph and why it came to be the cover of this translation?
No, at least this cover, we wanted something subtle, something that speaks to speaks that I mean, right? But the covers that we have, it's like each of his book has so because he's also a visual teacher and he's into arts. So each cover speaks so much about the poetry, the world he writes about. So I often think as a translator, we never think of like you look at a book, you open the book and start reading, start translating. But what the cover does to that book is something so profound, like how the book is, how you're drawn into that book. There's so much in the cover, especially when it comes from writers or who attach so much meaning to the cover. Often translations, like we think of translating the words, but in the cover itself is something that is untranslated and that says so much without words that is always lost in translation. So this book, when I think about translation, is not a lone act; it is a collaboration. And I say this because yes, Lana and I speak, and I speak to the Gopika and I work. But beyond all that, if you see, this book has the poems are translated by me. The conversation between me and Anand is translated by somebody else. And then there is, I think it's Getha and and then there's Bengali poems that is being translated into English. So it's like all these conversations between translators, between authors, that draws attention to this world in the global south that we think of conflict in one area, but then this conversation is about, as Gopika said, it is as much the poetry is about Sri Lanka. It is also all those zones that are constantly expanding. They're not stopping, right? And we are constantly like watching and we are witnessing, but we are like silent witnesses. There's only so much that can be translated. How do you translate a starved stomach? How do you translate a starved body? Right? For the human, even to like human has these words, right? Near famine, and then after like 10-15 days, then it will say famine. So for them to arrive at those specific words, they have to translate how people died, what contributed to those deaths. So what is nutrition? So what is that deficit? They have to arrive at those precise data, and that data is translated into near famine. There is like food shortage. All of these have like certain how it is all based on household security. How much meal one person can have in a day? How much do they have to spend to get that meal? If they have to spend like sell something to buy to eat, then it is like very close to like poor income. Yeah, as a poor income. Yeah. No, that's other. Yeah, I admit that's not novel. Where she writes so much about that starvation, and I translated that passage. We have this aspect. So I translated that passage, and I'm sitting and I'm thinking, and in my room, I have this cup of coffee with me, and when I'm like so emotional, like so heavy with emotion, I go to eat a chocolate, and I'm thinking, how do you translate starvation? Like it's so big. It's very hard. It's very hard. Like as we think of literature, we think of words, but just the starving body is so much to that you have to bring that in words, made experience.
So everyone who's here, I would say, the book is priced at only $3.99, and if you're wondering what you can do, I guess it's every one of us who buys a book and recommends it to someone else or gives it to someone else has made a contribution and broken the silence in one more household. So I would encourage all of you to pick up the book. The translator is, of course, here to sign copies.